So welcome back. We're going to begin the next session. And to introduce our guest speaker of the day, may I request my colleague, John Kedar, who is our advisor for GKI project, to introduce the guest speaker.
Great, thank you very much, Sanjay. And it's great to see people again. It's great to see some old friends and make new ones. And it was great on the GKI, Geospatial Knowledge Infrastructure course we've just run, to find people from all over the world enthused. And one of the things we talked about was the importance, the absolute importance of understanding the decision maker. We can understand geospatial as much as we like, but if we don't understand the decision maker, how can we deliver the geospatial knowledge they need in order to make those decisions? Now we've faced COVID as a global challenge, but climate change is undeniably the biggest challenge of our generation. And we know, in fact, in 2 weeks' time, COP26, international leaders gather again to look at the global situation and the global responses needed for climate change. And then national leaders have got to take those away and, in nations, adapt policies in order to meet net zero targets that they're all setting themselves. And that's a real challenge. And we know that data and knowledge, geospatial knowledge, are a critical part of it. But actually, we've got to understand those decision makers, the people making the policies, making the decisions. And we're very, very fortunate today to have someone who understands that world intimately. Dr. Manali Kumar is an expert in strategic issues, in politics, in climate change, and in strategic decision making. And she's going to lead us through some of these big political issues that politicians are going to have to grapple with regards to climate change. Recently, she was interviewed on the UK's BBC, and she made the absolute point that climate change mitigation needs to go far beyond ambitious pledges. So I'm sure she'll give us a little bit more insight into that as she talks. Dr. Manali is, as I say, an international expert. Currently, she is an international postdoctoral fellow with the Institute of Political Science at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. But she's also editor-in-chief of 9-Line, which is a fast-growing platform for expressing independent political views on issues affecting particularly the Indo-Pacific area. Dr. Manali, we look forward to what you have to say. Welcome on stage.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and to Sanjay for organizing this wonderful event and inviting me here today. It's been a very interesting morning for me to learn about the various possibilities of using geospatial data, and I hope learning a little bit more about the international politics of climate change would be interesting for you all as well. So, how does this work? There we go. Now, climate protests are in the news, it seems, every other day. In September 2019, some 6 million people participated in about 4,500 protests across 150 countries in the world. Climate change refers to global warming due to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as large shifts in weather patterns. These are processes that have been occurring for decades. But climate change is not something that's going to happen in the future. Our climate has already started changing today. Now, the latest data shows that global average temperatures have already increased more than 1 degree Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Very simply, the climate crisis is already here. Now, this figure shows global carbon dioxide emissions. These have increased dramatically during the 20th century. In 1950, the whole world at large emitted only about 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Today, we emit over 36 billion tons each year. Now, although the growth in emissions has reduced, emissions have not peaked yet. Not only is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at their highest level in 3 million years, in fact, they reached a new record this year in 2021. Although emissions reduced a little bit last year due to the disruptions in the global economy because of the pandemic, we know that fossil fuel emissions in 2021, especially in the power and industry sectors, have already returned to their pre-pandemic levels. Now, this figure maps out the future greenhouse gas emission scenarios and how they will affect temperatures under a range of assumptions. The thin blue line, it shows that even if all the current pledges and targets were implemented as promised, global temperatures will still increase by at least 2 degrees by the year 2100. We are already far off track when it comes to meeting the Paris goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Why does such a small increase in temperature matter? So with 1 degree Celsius of warming, we're already seeing that heat waves, wildfires, flooding, and superstorms are becoming more and more common. And these come with tremendous human and material costs. The wildfires in California in 2018 cost the US economy an estimated $148 billion. And the floods in Germany this year are estimated to cost about 17 to 23 million US dollars. Now, these extreme climate events are only going to become more common as we head towards a 2 degrees Celsius or even warmer world. Huge parts of the planet are going to become too hot for people to live, and as deserts expand, there will be even less land available for habitation and agriculture. As sea levels rise, many coastal cities and entire countries might simply cease to exist. We will have to confront millions of climate refugees in the coming decades. So the material costs are going to be tremendous. And even if we can absorb these material costs, are we willing to shoulder the human and ecological costs of a 2 degree or even warmer world? We need to act urgently to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Mitigation involves taking steps to limit further warming and its effects. For this, we must peak greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and reduce the concentrations of greenhouse gases that already exist in the atmosphere. The estimated costs of such policies is around $1.6 to $3.8 trillion per year. Adaptation involves adjusting to the current and future effects of global warming and climate change. Its goal is to reduce risks and vulnerabilities faced by people and societies. This will cost an estimated $180 billion a year. The costs of both mitigation and adaptation are going to be huge for all countries involved, but developing countries face much higher risks and also lower adaptive capacities due to their lower levels of social and economic development. So let's talk about mitigation. Around 73% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels for energy to power our industries, buildings, and transportation. So it is clear that we need to decarbonize our energy systems away from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and towards low carbon sources of energy like nuclear and renewables. And here's some data to try and understand the scale of the challenge of decarbonizing. We see that in 2019, 84% of the global primary energy mix came from fossil fuels, compared to only 16% from low-carbon sources. Global energy consumption is growing, and instead of increasing the share of low-carbon sources, the world is still burning more and more fossil fuels to meet their growing energy requirements. Meanwhile, even though more and more renewable sources are coming online every year, the progress in transitioning to low-carbon energy has been very slow. Now, this figure shows us the world's top 10 polluters. The top 5, no surprise, are China, the US, the EU, India, and Russia. And the bulk of their emissions come from burning fossil fuels for electricity and heat, manufacturing, and transportation. Together, the top 10 polluters emit over 2/3 of the world's greenhouse gases. Here we can see the per capita energy for the top 10 polluters from different sources. And what's common across the board is that the share of low carbon sources is very low in all of these economies, and nowhere near the levels needed to limit global warming. Clearly, each of these countries must act urgently to reduce their emissions and decarbonize their economies. Now, as I said before, poor countries face much bigger challenges in responding to climate change. This figure shows the gap in per capita income between the developed and developing economies. We can see quite clearly that developed societies in the US, Canada, the Euro area, Japan have much higher per capita incomes than developing countries. Given the developmental challenges that countries like China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia still face, they must continue to grow their economies, which will require access to energy. As they do so, however, they must try to avoid the carbon-intensive path to development and prosperity, which today's developed economies were able to enjoy. Today's poor countries need access to cheap, clean energy in order to develop. Developed economies have a very important role to play here. They can help by scaling up their own use of low-carbon energy, which will help reduce costs across the board, and they can also help by providing technology transfers and financial assistance to developed economies. So why are countries not doing more? Now, there are two sets of reasons for climate inaction. The first, of course, has to do with domestic politics and economic costs. As we saw, mitigation and adaptation policies are very costly. And as we transition away from fossil fuels, many industries and workers will suffer, even though there will be new economic opportunities. But a second set of reasons relates to international politics and the difficulties of finding agreement between nearly 200 countries, each with their own national interest. So here is a quick high-level overview of international climate politics. The landmark United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, what is commonly known as the UNFCCC, was signed at the 1992 Earth Summit, and it entered into force in 1994. Now, this convention is important because it recognized that developing countries could not adequately respond to the challenge of climate change under the principles of sovereign equality of all states and therefore equal burden sharing. So some leading developing economies, particularly Brazil, China, and India, led a coalition of other developing countries to successfully argue and negotiate the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR. And this principle is included in the UNFCCC. Developing countries argued that climate change has primarily been brought about by the economic activities of developed countries. This principle recognizes that as developing countries continue to meet their developmental needs, their emissions will continue to grow. Therefore, the CBDR principle requires developed countries to take the lead in mitigating climate change. The next most important multilateral agreement was the 1994 Kyoto Protocol, and it built on the CBDR principle. The protocol set binding emissions reductions targets for developed countries and exempted developing countries from such commitments. And although the 2009 Copenhagen summit was not very successful, developed countries committed to jointly providing $100 billion per year in climate finance to developing countries by 2020 to help with mitigation activities. The 2015 Paris Agreement set the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, while pursuing efforts to try and limit this increase to only 1.5 degrees. This is to be achieved by peaking developed country greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, while recognizing that it will take developing countries longer to do so. It also established binding commitments for all countries to announce their nationally determined contributions towards mitigating climate change. Now, these arguments about the historic emissions and therefore current responsibilities of developed countries is reflected in historic emissions data. In this figure, we see that since the year 1750, the vast majority of cumulative emissions have come from Europe and North America. So it really is no surprise that developing countries expect developed economies to take the lead in mitigating global warming. However, the CBDR principle has become a major point of disagreement in multilateral negotiations because some important questions remain unaddressed. For example, when exactly can we consider developed countries to have fulfilled their responsibility to take the lead? And when would it be reasonable to require developing countries to also accept binding emissions reduction targets? Now, these questions have become more important as some developing economies like China and India have emerged as rising powers, and they have steeply rising emissions today. And some developed countries, especially the United States, insist that major economies, particularly China, must do more, even though they have developmental challenges. But there are two important things to note about the emissions of developing economies, which we can see in this figure with per capita CO2 emissions of the top 10 polluters. First, although India and China's emissions are beginning to grow slowly, this is a trend that only emerged after 1950. And although China has the world's largest aggregate emissions, in fact, even today, China's per capita emissions are much lower than those of the United States. Per capita emissions of Indonesia, Brazil, and India are even lower than those of China. So the next major international negotiation on climate change will begin next week in Scotland. Have the major polluters made any new commitments? Can we expect any meaningful change at COP26? In July this year, the European Union announced a range of policy measures to help reach a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. These include plans to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars, among other measures to decarbonize the European economy. The EU's plans are ambitious and go in the right direction of overhauling industry and transforming lifestyles. But the path to approving these measures is going to be very difficult. First, because 27 different countries must agree. And second, because many of these measures mean that household costs will increase. So solutions need to be found for making lifestyle sustainable for individual families and households. Under the leadership of President Joe Biden, the United States has rejoined the Paris Agreement. The US also plans to reduce emissions by about 50% below 2005 levels by 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2050. The Biden administration has also put together a $3.5 trillion package deal to build back better and help achieve its climate goals. However, whether Biden can deliver on any of these promises depends on congressional approval, and unfortunately, like much of recent history, the signs are not optimistic. The US Congress has a long history of failing to pass climate change legislation. It failed to ratify the landmark Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997, and the US pulled out entirely from the Paris Agreement under former President Donald Trump. An important problem is that US Republicans and corporations have long opposed climate action and actively undermine scientific research on the topic. In the last few days, some Democratic senators have already said that they will not support important key clean energy and climate provisions in Biden's climate plan, citing its steep price tag and the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel sector. Now, for its part, China has announced that it will peak emissions by 2030 and achieve a carbon-neutral economy by 2060. President Xi Jinping announced last month that China was going to stop building new coal-based power projects abroad. However, ongoing domestic coal-fired power and steel projects are still an important concern and not something that has been addressed by China yet. And India has previously promised to reduce emissions 33 to 35% below 2005 levels by 2030. However, it has not announced when it plans to peak its emissions and when it plans to achieve net zero emissions. And it has not updated its nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement ahead of COP26 yet either. Preliminary estimates suggest that India will need over 2.5 trillion US dollars to meet its climate change actions between now and 2030. Ahead of COP26, India's finance minister criticized the inadequate actions being taken by developed countries and stated India's position in no uncertain terms. She called on developed countries to legislate for net zero emissions by 2030 and made it clear that developing countries cannot transition to net zero emissions without substantial financial support and technology transfers from developed countries. Which brings us to climate finance. Now, as part of international agreements, developed countries agreed to collectively mobilize $100 billion in financial aid for developing countries per year. In 2019, they together contributed just under $80 billion. What's worse is that 80% of this assistance was provided in the form of loans rather than grants. Now, this graphic shows us which countries are contributing their fair share of climate finance and which ones are not. Larger, wealthier, and more carbon-intensive economies have a greater responsibility to provide climate finance. We can see that while a few major economies, especially Germany and to a lesser extent France and Japan, are meeting their finance commitments, most developed countries are not providing as much financial assistance as they should be. The worst offender, no surprise, is the United States. Joe Biden has said he intends to increase the US's contribution to $11.4 billion by 2024. But as we can see here, the US should be providing about $43.4 billion. And so even Biden's commitment does not go nearly far enough. So where does all this leave us? The fact is that our world today is already 1 degree Celsius warmer, and even the best case scenario, based on all the promises our politicians have made, are going to make the world still at least 2 degrees warmer by the end of the century. The choice we face today is between pursuing short-term prosperity and facing future devastation, or bearing costs today to safeguard the future of the planet. Meeting the challenge of climate change and protecting the environment will be costly for businesses and consumers. We need strong political leadership and new values to forge ahead. We cannot rely on how we have done things in the past as guides for the future. So I think these 4 R's can be a good start. We must reduce emissions dramatically and immediately. Kicking this can down the road to 2050 will be much too late for the planet. We need to deploy technologies to remove greenhouse gases that are already concentrated in the atmosphere. We must also start working to repair the damaged climate and ecosystems. And finally, we must redefine how we measure growth and what we consider progress today. And I think gathered here are a lot of people with amazing technologies and ideas on how we can start contributing to some of these goals. As we head towards COP26, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of inspirational sound bites from world leaders, as each of them tries to convince others to do more. But politicians are very good at making promises. What we need is for governments, especially of the world's major economies, to enact bold policies that privilege people and the planet, not corporate profits. This is what we must demand, and this is what we must hold our political leaders accountable for. I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.